Hello, I am Johnny Lockjaw. Well, if you wouldn't believe it, the devs for Fun Dog Studios did another round of Q&A questions through their Discord server on the foreverwinter. Let's talk about it. Good news this week is there's another video that I get to link to you. That'll be in the description down below. Also, again, I'm going to be breaking these down into different sections just to sort of make it a little easier to navigate. With that being said, let's get into some gameplay stuff. Fundog provided some clarifications on the different skills and abilities that define the characters. Again, they talked about this previously in a different QA. Most of the character skills are work in progress. What they're trying to focus on right now is making the characters both systemically and aesthetically unique. It definitely sounds like they're trying to make it so there isn't a one-size-fits-all character for each job that it is that you want to do. So depending on what it is that you want to do, they'll probably need to pick a different character for different things. Realistically, also, they said that there's definitely still things to work on. Again, Gunhead I don't think is going to be available on early access launch. It's just an example of things that aren't necessarily up to speed. Definitely something to keep in mind. They're working on things. They added that they might add some teasers for different skill tree pathings or prototypes for different stuff in the Discord server. I would join that if you wanted to see that stuff. Realistically, it seems that there's probably going to be obvious diversity changes that are going to be happening between the characters and the skill pathings. They sound pretty bare bones for the time being, which again is early access. It's kind of what you're buying into if you get it early. That's what the whole thing is. I do like the idea of making the characters unique from one another so that they aren't, again, all one size fits all in terms of what it is that you might want to do. The prominent example right now, obviously, is that Gunhead has a gun for a head and it shoots a gun. And that Scab Girl is really, really fast and you can upgrade her speed to be really, really fast, but she doesn't carry a lot of stuff. It's funny, they gave a really long-winded answer to basically say that the characters are essentially just classes, which is fine. It's a character shooter for the most part. That's kind of how it works. Moving on, somebody asked about if there will be a suppressive fire mechanic. Good news on that is that they are willing to try. I guess the bad news in that is that they probably won't be able to implement it in any real way soon, which kind of sounds pretty similar to a lot of different answers here. The good news is you can already kind of do this. They went on to explain that there are already two systems that are in play that work against this or for this, depending on a bunch of different factors. So for instance, if you are in a firefight with a squad and they can see your location, they will relay that location to other friendly units for them so that you will get encapsulated or enclosed on or flanked, basically. So with that in mind, if you shoot and draw aggro, it'll make your location known, obviously, and then you'll get pushed by possibly other enemies, which, you know, obviously isn't super great. I mean, realistically, it's probably a ways away if it's added at all, but I'm all for adding cool new systems to this game that already has a bunch of cool systems that I don't think I've ever experienced before. Obviously, I've experienced a suppression mechanic that's not a very unique thing to if it would ever come to Foreverwinter, but it's still a cool system to add to a plethora of other things. Somebody asked again over how the progression for co-op really works, so they went on to re-explain the co-op progression, which is basically that if you join somebody's innards, you are using theirs for the time being. So for example, if you join somebody and their innards has all the traders, but you don't, you get access to all of the traders. Everything after that is basically personal progression. You gain all of the experience that you gain all of the money that you gain all of the loot that you gain. Any water that you add to the water collection goes to your innards water storage. Again, they've explained this, I think, a couple of times now, but, you know, just in case you forgot or didn't know. And now we're moving on to the lore stuff. Somebody asked if you could heal enemy soldiers. What they went over in this is not necessarily something like, yes, we've been thinking about whether or not you can rescue an enemy. It's more about things that they considered something like missions of mercy, where you would bring supplies, healing stuff to different enemy faction camps. It definitely sounds like they've thought about this premise before, and it doesn't obviously seem like that'll probably be anywhere close to when early access launches, but it's definitely something to keep in mind going forward. I do think that it's kind of cool as an idea to humanize the enemy soldiers, at least the grunts for the time being. Obviously in the lore, I don't think a lot of us know about why the foot soldiers are warring the way that they are, or at least why they are a part of the army. I think it'll be interesting to humanize them in a way that gives the player more perspective on what it is that they're doing. Again, we are scavengers. We are not super soldiers. We aren't even soldiers. It's kind of something important. To sort of build off of that, they also responded to whether or not the enemies will make mistakes in their combat tactics, or whether or not sometimes the enemies might run away from you in fear. A funny response. If the enemies are bugged, they will show a mistake. On a more serious note, they did add that there were tinkering with a morale system. It's definitely something that they've thought about to the point where they have prototype animations for this kind of stuff. They might share that in the Discord. Join the Discord. But it's not going to be available, if it will be at all, anytime soon. There is apparently an enemy that will spot you and in certain circumstances run away, but there wasn't any further clarification on that. It seemed more like an Easter egg than anything. So be on the lookout for that. That was basically all that was for lore, so let's move on to the technical questions. Because there's concept art showing this, I assume, somebody asked whether or not the drones can grab you. So for now, it sounds like no, for a bunch of different technical reasons. They're definitely toying around with adding different animations that the enemies can do, and sort of special victory kills, similar to the way that the Mother Courage will grab you and tear your arms off, basically. It sounds like they have their animation person kind of doing what it is that they can for the moment, so who knows what's going on with that. Definitely no grabbing. So because there is friendly fire between the scavs, somebody wanted to know whether or not there was friendly fire between the enemy factions. Apparently they've already tried this, but what would end up happening is the fields would be completely empty, because all of the enemies would kill themselves. Because there are mechs, obviously, and even some of the ground infantry have explosive ammunition, it would basically just turn into a killing field of all of the enemy units murking each other effectively and wiping each other out, which would be really funny to see, but it wouldn't provide with excellent gameplay, unfortunately. Something to note on that, though, is that the enemies are programmed to not shoot at each other's backs, basically, if somebody's standing in front of them. So, you know, use that to your advantage. For people that need, for one reason or another, the ability to change key mappings, you will be able to do that fully. So good. On a side note, if you have something that's an accessibility system, that's something for like disabilities and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't sound like they've done a lot of testing for it specifically, but if it's a one-to-one transfer between, say, like a controller input and then whatever thing you have and use, it sounds like it'll be one-to-one usable like that, but they haven't done any specific testing for anything like accessibility device-wise. On a cool note for me, they answered one of the questions that I presented. Basically, if you've seen some of the gameplay I had, you'll notice that the AI teammates kind of shoot everything indiscriminately on sight, or at least they did. Apparently, they've fixed that. Apparently, what was causing this issue was a bug. Who would have thought? They are adding different commands for you to give to the AI teammates. Number 1 is follow me. Number 2 is go there. Number 3 is come back to me. And number 4 is shoot that. It is worth noting now that the AI teammates are programmed to not initiate a combat engagement unless you tell them to go someplace and then an enemy starts firing at them because you told the AI teammate to stand in front of the enemies, and the enemies were like, hey. They won't initiate engagements. They will act if you act or tell it to shoot something, but unless you do that, they aren't going to be the ones to do that anymore. So now you won't see the AI magged up the mamas on site, unfortunately, but at least we got to see it once. Bad news for people who want a dedicated first-person mode. It's not going to be in the game. It sounded like the qualification for that was that other games did first-person mode well, so the foreverwinter doesn't have to. Does sound more like they just don't want to implement a first-person mode, which is totally fine. They did mention that if it was a competitive game, they might think a different way, but right now that isn't how things are going. I think that this is fine. I don't think that this game needs first-person mode. I think that it detracts from it more than anything. Yeah, it might add a little immersion, but what little it would add would just detract from everything else, like, oh, look at how cool this world is. Oh, look at how cool this character looks. Again, I don't really want or need a first-person mode, so this doesn't affect me. But if it does for you, there it is. Anyway, after that, let's go into some planned content. Big news, there was a planned demo that they have. So within the next month, or probably closer to the end of October, they are going to be adding a demo for people. A quick note, it was between optimization for the game and getting the demo ready for early access launch, which is why it's not going to be available at launch. But this is good news. Apparently, it's mostly supposed to be to see whether or not your hardware can run the game, because again, there are pretty bad performance optimizations right now, which is super cool to see from a developer. They're actually going out of their way to implement something that is super pro-consumer in terms of trying to figure out whether, again, you can actually buy the game and play it so that you don't have to waste your time or money purchasing a game that your hardware can't run, and then suddenly you're either stuck with it because you went over whatever the return policy was for these games. On top of it, again, as a creative, I know how difficult this is to admit sometimes. Them being willing to say, hey, our performance optimization is not good right now. We need to give the player base some form form of way to test whether or not they can actually run this game, how they want to run it, and this is super cool to see. I don't know a whole lot of other teams that would be willing to both admit that this is a problem that they need addressing and address it in a way that's super pro-consumer and is actively as good as a decision as it is. Plus, it's a demo, so if you're cautious as to whether or not this game's jank is going to push you away, maybe you can test it when it's available to see if it still does that. After that, they went over some ideas for functionalities of different units. On this topic, I would definitely go to the video in the description. They went over this in much better depth than I'm going to right now. So the basics of it are they are working on a lot of different systems to address a lot of different things that are going on at any given time. It definitely sounds like they're going like an outward in approach where they're thinking about, like, say, an AI director that determines different scopes of battles, different units that director would deploy for whatever specific purposes. The prominent example that they gave was a Euruscan grabber reacting differently to like XYZ parameter that forced it or changed its decision making somehow. So they are working on things, but whether or not those things will be implemented anytime soon is probably not for the foreseeable future. A fun thing for people, somebody asked whether there will be side activities or games in the innards. They are already sort of working on different things to add to the innards. They gave an example of a shooting range. Apparently that's supposed to sort of flesh the area out, which I do think it needs. My time in it was pretty limited, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot going on in there. Apparently they're thinking about adding different minigames that you can play. They're also talking about maybe an anti-up system for specific runs that you can do. For example, let's say you tell your friend that you wager, I can do this next run with this one pistol or these two pistols. Stuff like that. Whether or not that's going to be added is up in the air for a lot of different reasons apparently, but they are toying with stuff. We don't really have a lot of reason to be in the innards other than to buy stuff and collect your gear. So any little thing like that I enjoy. It's very cool to see an area fleshed out that we spend a major part of our time in. So we'll have to see. Once again, they went over this in one of the last QAs, but they went over again proximity voice chat. So they said that the reason there isn't going to be a VoIP system on early access launch is because they didn't want to just have a half-baked thing in the game that didn't have different systems at play that made sense. On top of that, it sounds like they're trying to maybe add radio signal wavelength kind of stuff, similar to the way walkie-talkies kind of work, where if you go past a certain distance, they literally don't communicate with one another. It sounds kind of like something they want to do with that. But again, they didn't add it on early access launch because they didn't want to just have an underbaked thing. They want to have some sort of underlying mechanic for it to be there. As somebody who basically uses Discord for every game, unless there's a reason to be in game chat, this is totally fine for me. I get that some people probably want to have some interaction with the community that they're playing with if they play in public servers, but you do kind of have access to that because there will be a functional type chat, but there isn't going to be a functional game chat as of yet. They assured that they're going to be adding it basically as soon as it meets their quality standards. When that is, who knows? After that, there was some miscellaneous questions. Somebody asked how the studio was funded. The basic rundown apparently is that they started with a really small team, the pandemic hit, then they partnered with a different team. After that, they split with that team and then joined Epic. And then after that, that's kind of what it is that we're at now. It sounds like the story here is that unless Fundog Studios is owned by Epic, which I don't get the vibe of, then it doesn't really sound like they make any money at all right now, which, you know, if you're making a game and this is the first game you're making, kind of makes sense. Obviously, this is what's pushing them to release early access as early as the build is. For me, at the very least, and I know for a lot of different people, the state of the build isn't really going to deter a lot of people. So on a positive note, they are really happy with the way that they can monetize the way that they can. And obviously, with that being said, they are giving us the opportunity to play early access. They are giving us the opportunity to pay more money to support them, and they're going to give us a cool thing. But besides that, again, it doesn't really sound like they're making a whole lot of money right now. With the state of the early access build right now, and as the early access system as a whole, somebody wanted to know what it is that the devs were doing to avoid feature creep, basically. The prominent example in the question was Hawken, and I'm not up to date on my Hawken lore, but basically the dev team wants to maintain the initial vision as much as they can while taking into account and weighing community feedback. Again, they do that by testing it to what it is that their initial vision is. What it is that they did to start that a lot of games apparently don't do is they built a very wide base so that they could start building up higher from, basically. I like that as a system in play. it basically allows them to add any content and have it make sense for them to do that. On top of it, basically just adding more stuff. This will allow them to grow organically instead of being forced to make changes or just do things for no reason. They also wanted to assure that certain subsects of people that needed a specific feature, and they said PvP for this, but they didn't really mean to throw shade, for them to be able to take the game into consideration, won't be considered, basically. Miles specifically said that a game made for everyone is a game made for no one. And I think this is a pretty astute point, especially with the way that the games industry is right now. Adding a system that doesn't align with their vision just because it'll bring maybe more people into the game doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. With that being said, this does kind of play into the whole water system thing, where community feedback right now is that it doesn't seem like it's a very good idea, but their dev vision sort of says that they want to do it anyway. So we'll see how that plays out, at least in terms of this specific example. That's the only bit I'm going to say on the water system. There wasn't a question on it. A really cool thing, actually, somebody wanted to know whether they worked on the game with some people who had military backgrounds. Apparently they consulted with Ground Thumb. I don't know that person, but they're a big enough deal for some people for that to be significant. They also went and talked to different military veterans from a bunch of different American wars, basically. And what it is that they did is they asked how it is that these combat tactics would work within different units, which made sense for them to weigh in on, basically. Obviously, there are some pretty futuristic and weird looking things that they had to weigh in on, so they probably didn't go a whole lot of in-depth on that, but squad tactics they definitely apparently talked about. There's a bunch of other stuff. I'd watch the video. Obviously, this is super cool, and first-hand experience on this kind of stuff is going to make the AI better. It turns out that military tactics being used as a baseline for these military units is probably a good thing. After that, they went on to answer whether there will be fishing. Now, obviously in the question, it was noted that the oceans are probably dried up, the rivers are probably dried up, there's probably not a whole lot of fishing, but it does seem like something that they're open to, or at least in terms of like magnet fishing for scrap or stuff, it sounds like something that they're willing to try, or at least see if it'll work. Now, I wouldn't get your hopes up, but this is kind of neat. And finally, and besides the question that they answered that I asked specifically, this is my favorite one. Someone asked, can you pet the dog? There's also a little bit more on hideout pets specifically. It sounds like they're going to have different dog models that they want to try to implement on top of a bunch of different little things or different animals that they could add. But, and good news, you will be able to pet the dog at some point, but it probably needs to be added soon. Realistically, for me, the sooner I can pet the dog, the sooner you have to stop worrying why I'm not petting that dog. And that wraps up the QI questions that they had. Like always, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, don't be afraid to like, comment, follow, and subscribe. I would genuinely appreciate it. But until then, do me a favor, please don't die. I will see you in the next one.